All right. Today, everybody, I am Dr. Tirsha Manalaysay, and for today, I will be discussing fluids and electrolytes. So what are body fluids? These refers to the body water in which solutes and electrolytes are dissolved. And water is the largest single constituent of the body, and it differs between age, gender, and body fat. So it's around 50% of body weight in women and around 60% in men. It is further divided into two parts, your intracellular fluid and your extracellular fluid. Your extracellular fluid is further divided into your interstitial and your intravascular fluid spaces in a 1:3 ratio. So the one that we are able to access is actually just the intravascular space. So we can only approximate how much is in the intravascular space. We cannot actually compute for the exact amount, but at least we have signs and symptoms that can tell us whether the fluid in the intravascular space is enough or not. But fluids in the intracellular spaces and the interstitial spaces are actually measurable, or it's quite difficult to measure. So this is a graphic representation of what it looks like in the body. So the yellow part there is your intracellular fluid. The fluid inside your blood vessels or the plasma that's your intravascular fluid. And your light blue portion, that's the interstitial fluid. So that's in between your cells. So we always equate muscle mass with water and adipose with less water. So for overweight or obese patients and women who tend to have less muscle mass than men, we have less water. Okay. Older adults, because through time, when they become elderly, they lose muscle mass. So they also lose water. Children, that's a no-brainer because children have smaller body surface areas. So what are the sources of water? So it's number one, it's from the food that we eat. It's around 700 ml per day on an average. So it depends on how much you eat in a day. It comes from the ones that we drink, which is most often voluntarily controlled, yung mga social drinking. Or if you just feel like drinking whatever, soda, juice, milk teas, etc. And then you have metabolic water, okay, which is around 200 ml per day, which is produced as a byproduct of aerobic respiration. So how do we regulate water intake? So the most important mechanism here would be your thirst mechanism. So this is triggered when you have decreased blood volume and increased osmolarity, I will explain later, which senses or sends signals to your peripheral volume sensors, your central osmoreceptors, send signals to the hypothalamus where thirst, or wherein afterwards you feel thirsty. So that compels you to drink. So what are the routes of gains and losses? So we have the kidneys. So the usual daily urine volume is around 1 to 2 liters or around 0.5 to 1 ml per kilogram per hour. So take note, it's based on the body weight. So there's no definite volume that you should target per hour, like 35 cc. Some say 35 cc per hour is adequate. No, you have to compute it per kilogram. You also lose water from the skin through sweating, wherein your chief solutes are sodium chloride and a little bit of potassium. So that's why your sweat salty. And it will depend on the environmental temperature, the ambient temperature. So if it's a little too hot outside, you lose a little more water because of excessive sweating. Lungs also eliminate water vapor. Okay, so this is increased with evaporation of water is increased with increased respiratory rate or depth. So patients who are tachypnic, they tend to lose more water. That's why you have to factor that in when you're trying to compute for your maintenance fluid rates. The gastrointestinal tract contributes the least because the bulk of the fluid is reabsorbed in the small intestine. So for the maintenance of arterial circulatory integrity, why are we talking about this? Because as I've said, the one compartment that we can actually access and have at least an estimation of how much is in it is the intravascular space, which if you don't have enough or you have so much will affect the integrity of your circulation. So this is because of the sodium potassium ATPase pump, which is the most abundant pump in the body and contributes to about 85 to 90% of sodium being in the extracellular fluid space. So as we all know, water follows sodium. So your ECF volume is actually a function of your total body sodium content. Okay. And your circulation is then determined by your renal sodium retention or excretion. So it depends on how much sodium is in the intravascular space or in the extracellular fluid that will dictate the integrity of your arterial circulation. Okay, this plus the modulation of your systemic arterial resistance. So that controls basically what we call our blood pressure. So in an ideal setting, wherein you're neither dehydrated or overhydrated, your intake usually equates to your output. So 2.5, if you take in 2.5 ml of liquids, you put out also 2.5 ml of liquids. Okay, so you must remember that your kidneys are not storage organs, they are regulatory organs. So they just regulate accordingly to how much, say for example, water or electrolytes or a certain solute is needed by the body. So that's basically its main function. So what are the signs and symptoms of intravascular fluid volume depletion, or what we call hypovolemia? You have fatigue, weakness, thirst, poor skin turgor, dry oral mucous membranes, basically signs of dehydration. You'd have increased heart rate, wherein you'd have orthostatic tachycardia, okay, wherein you have an increase of more than 50 to 20 beats per minute upon standing. Postural dizziness or your orthostatic hypotension. You'd have decreased central venous pressure, decrease in body weight because, again, half or more than half of your body weight is actually water. And then you'd have imbalances in your fluid input and output because what the body needs, your kidneys will regulate and try to adapt and bring it back to its normal level at least. So what are the instances wherein you'd have increased water requirements? You have fever, burns, fever. So you have the higher the temperature, the more water you lose to evaporation. Burn patients tend to lose more because they lose skin. Okay, they lose the integrity of the skin, which is the protective barrier from water losses. So the presence of surgical drains, your NGTs, Penrose drains, JP drains, and also be a source of water loss. If you have GI losses such as vomiting or diarrhea, sweating, tachypnea, polyuria. So these are some instances wherein you'd have increased water requirements. So it's best to note this in your patients so that you will be able to anticipate how much water you will need to replace or at least give your patient to maintain normal fluid balance. So there are two types of water losses. You have sensible losses and insensible losses. So sensible losses, these are your urine output mostly, because these are losses that you can actually measure. So if you put in a Foley catheter, you can get the exact ml per hour. Okay. On the other hand, insensible losses, these are not measurable. So the water that we lose through the skin, the lungs, or the feces, we won't actually measure those, but it's around, on an average, 600 to 800 ml. So how do we regulate urine concentration and volume? So as I've said, our kidneys are regulatory organs. So it will just adjust to whatever the body needs. So if your blood concentration goes high, the kidneys will produce less urine because it will reabsorb more water. It will conserve water to help bring down blood concentration. And on the other hand, if you have a decreased blood concentration, then you'd have more production of urine because you don't need it anymore. Okay, so you need to have that equilibrium. So it's not neither greedy or complicated. So it will just get what it needs, your kidneys, and it will just try to maintain everything within balance. So for the exchange of water between cellular and extracellular fluids, I hope you remembered all of these. These are basic. So osmosis is just the movement of water across cell membranes. Then you have osmotic forces, which is the prime determinant of water distribution in the body, or what we call Starling forces. Okay, so you have two major pressures: your hydrostatic pressure, which is the pressure in the blood vessels resulting from the weight of your water, and your cardiac contraction. So it will largely depend on your cardiac contraction. And your oncotic pressure, which is exerted by your proteins, which act like a sponge to absorb water back into the intravascular fluid space. So say, for example, imagine going down a water slide. So you are the hydrostatic pressure. So when you go down, the water will go out of the slide, or water spills outside. Okay, because of your pressure. You are the hydrostatic pressure. So if you have too much of that hydrostatic pressure, you will eventually deplete the intravascular fluid volume. So you need an opposing force, or an opposing pressure through proteins, so that you won't have intravascular volume depletion. So this is just a picture of how it should be. No? So there should be no net movement, or at least just a very minimal movement of fluids between the intravascular spaces and the outside. Okay, there should be a balance between your filtration and your reabsorption. So this is where your hydrostatic pressure and your oncotic pressure comes in. So we all know this one, no? So the general rule here is, if we're talking about water, water will always tend to dilute something that is concentrated. So water will transfer from a compartment wherein it is dilute to a more concentrated compartment. Okay, and as far as solutes are concerned, solutes move in a direction wherein they won't be so cramped. So solutes will move from an area of greater concentration to an area of lesser concentration. Okay, so just remember that basic detail. So what then is the relation of plasma sodium concentration to osmolality? Okay, so let's go back to osmolality. This is the concentration of a solution expressed as the total number of solute particles per kilogram. So just take note of the unit of measurement here. So basically, this is how much concentrated your solution is, or how concentrated your solution is. So it depends on how many solutes are inside. That's your osmolality. But if you're talking about, if your unit of measurement is solute particles per liter, that is osmolarity. But the definition basically is the same. Okay, so just to remind you, osmolarity and osmolality is totally different from tonicity. So when we talk about osmolarity and osmolality, this pertains to the total solute concentrations, regardless of whether it incites movement of water across membranes or not. But when you talk about tonicity, this is the concentration of only the impermeable solute particles, basically particles that can influence movement across membranes. So there are differences in the extracellular and intracellular solute compositions because of transporters, your channels, and your ATP-driven membrane pumps. And as I've said earlier, most abundant ATPase pump would be your sodium-potassium ATPase pump. So most of your plasma osmoles, because of this sodium-potassium ATPase pump, are sodium. Okay, so lesser contributions are from other ions like glucose and urea. In fact, glucose and urea alone will not be able to move water across cell membranes. So it's a very small particle that can easily cross cell membranes. And so therefore, if you say increased plasma osmolarity, okay, you also equate that to hypernatremia or having low total body water because you have a more concentrated solution. Okay, and because 85 to 90% of your extracellular fluid is sodium, that means you're abundant in sodium as well. Okay, and on the other hand, if you have decreased plasma osmolality, you may equate that to hyponatremia or having high total body water. So yeah, again, this is how sodium potassium ATPase pump works. It throws so much of the sodium in the extracellular fluid and potassium mainly in the intracellular fluid compartment. So let's go to practical application. So the types of fluids. These are the types of fluids that we have, that we use in the clinics. The first one are the colloids. These are solutions that contain large molecules. So large molecules. Basically, they are unable to move across cell membranes easily. So if you give colloids, they mostly stay in the intravascular space, such as your albumin, your hydroxyethyl starch. We have nowadays Voluven. Okay, those large-sized molecules that are suspended in solutions are called colloids. So we use it in acute instances wherein we have to bring blood pressure or we have to fill in the intravascular fluid volume in hurry. Okay, so you may give albumin or your Voluven, your Hysteril. Okay, the crystalloids, on the other hand, these are smaller molecules that can easily cross cell membranes, but they mostly stay in the extracellular fluid. So they increase volume in that compartment alone in general. We have different kinds of crystalloids. So these are usually the fluids that we use for fluid resuscitation or maintenance fluid. Your day-to-day fluid requirement can be supplied by your crystalloids. So isotonic would mean it's basically the tonicity of that solution is basically the same as that of your plasma. hypotonic solutions or crystalloids have more water in it than solutes. That's why it's hypotonic. And then if you're talking about hypertonic solutions, you have more solutes in it than water. Okay, so let's see. Again, the isotonic solutions are those that are almost similar to plasma. So these are your 0.9 normal saline solution, your lactated Ringer solution, your Ringer solution. So it almost approximates how much sodium is in your extracellular fluid. Okay. This is the one that we use for fluid resuscitation. Because if you have hypovolemia, decreased blood pressure, and you need to fill that intravascular space, you need to keep it in the extracellular fluid compartment. So that is why when you want to hydrate someone, you want to bring the blood pressure up because he or she lacks water, you use isotonic solutions, not hypotonic solutions, not hypertonic solutions. So you might think it's like an SOP, no? But there's actually a logic behind it, why we use plain NSS or plain LR to rehydrate our patient. Hypotonic solutions have low concentration of solutes, as I've said, which causes now shifts of fluids from the intravascular space to the intracellular and interstitial spaces, basically hydrating your cell. Because again, water will always tend to dilute something that is more concentrated. Water will move to an area of somewhere where it is mostly concentrated because of lots of solutes. So you only use hypotonic solutions in hypernatremia, wherein you'd have low body water in relation to your sodium, your diabetes ketoacidosis, and your hyperglycemic, your HHS, basically. The hypertonic solutions have higher tonicity or solute concentration, and as you can see, the osmolality of which is 375 milliosmoles or higher. So the normal osmolality of fluids or plasma is around, let's say, 270 to 290. So around that much. So 375 milliosmoles or higher, that's too much. This will cause shifts of water from the intracellular space to the extracellular space, basically dehydrating the cells. So we never use this to resuscitate patients or fluid resuscitate patients. We only use this in instances wherein you'd have, say, for example, hyponatremia, severe hyponatremia, you may use hypertonic solutions then. So just for you to be able to remember, so isotonic, iso meaning same, your 0.9 NaCl, your plain LR, this does not cause any changes in your cells because it's basically the same as your plasma. If you use hypertonic solutions because of the shift of water from the intracellular space to the extracellular space, then basically it will cause crenation or destruction of your cells. It will dehydrate the cells. Hypotonic, with the emphasis of the big O in hypotonic, have lower osmotic pressures. That's why it causes cells to swell, basically. So these are the types of intravenous fluids that we have. As I've said, plain NSS approaches plasma levels of sodium. So that's around 154 MEQ. And almost always sodium is paired with chloride. Okay. And as you go down, as you add more water, free water, like if you add D5 water, which is totally devoid of any solutes. As you can see here, D5 water, zero sodium, zero chloride, you dilute that solution. So the lower you go, the more hypotonic it is. Okay? So D5 water is the most hypotonic of them all because it has nothing in it. D5.45 is basically half of your 0.9% plain NSS. It's basically plain NSS, 50% of plain NSS and 50% of D5 water, making it 0.45. That's why your sodium is 75 and your chloride is around 75. Okay? So on the other hand, 3% hypertonic saline. Look at um, the the concentration or the amount of sodium in it, 513. That is too much, and it's so far away from the normal plasma levels. Okay, so it will really cause what? Hypertonic. It will really cause destruction of your cells. Okay, because of water shifting out of your intercellular compartments. So this is like a summary of what I have been telling you. Okay. Why don't we use D5 water in hydrating patients? Because D5 water or dextrose 5% in water, it has zero solutes, right? So what it does is just it dissipates in all of your compartments. So it will not affect or add to your extracellular space, which is your primary goal in the first place when you're hydrating patients. Crystalloids stay in the extracellular space, but as you can see here, it also will include your interstitial spaces. That's why if you give too much crystalloids, you may also develop edema. Okay? Colloids, on the other hand, stay only in the intravascular space because of their large molecular weights or large molecular sizes. But we do not use this as maintenance fluids. Why? Because eventually, if you have too much of these colloids in the intravascular space, it will also cause shifts of water across these compartments. And on top of that, colloids are very pricey. So let's go to application. Problem 1. You have an 18-year-old female who was brought into the emergency room due to profuse vaginal bleeding. So on history, they found that she induced abortion. She arrived weak-looking, extremely pale, with cold, clammy extremities. Vital signs, take note, the BP was already palpatory 60. Heart rate, tachycardic, 130. Your respiratory rate, 24, but the temperature was low. In this scenario, what is your IVF of choice? Is it A, plain NSS, B, D5.3, C, 3% hypertonic saline, or D, D5 water? If you've listened to me earlier, what is our number one priority here? Our number one priority would be to bring the blood pressure up. Because if you don't bring that up, it will kill your patient, right? So in order for you to bring the blood pressure up, you need to fill the intravascular fluid compartment. And how will you do that? D5 water definitely will not, because again, it will dissipate into all of your compartments equally. 3% will cause so much of water shifting because of the super high sodium content. D5.3 NaCl is more water than solutes. So more water will go into your intracellular interstitial spaces, and only a portion, like a third, would go into your intravascular space. And that will not help you significantly if your BP is palpatory 60. So the correct answer here would be plain NSS. Okay? For problem number 2, we have a 55-year-old male who had been having loose watery stools for 3 days, so diarrhea basically. And on the 3rd day, he felt very weak. Hence, he decided to go to the emergency room. Vital signs, the ER, blood pressure 80/60, heart rate slightly tachycardic 105, RR 20, and now you have the liberty of your laboratory results. You have sodium of 150, 150, which is high. I'm telling you now, it's high. Potassium 2.8, and a Crea of 1.0 milligrams per deciliter. So what then is your ideal choice? So again, look at the problem. What's your primary goal here? Again, your primary goal would be to bring your blood pressure up. Okay? But how will you do that? What will you give if your sodium is already 150? So if you answered A, plain NSS, then you're absolutely correct. It's still plain NSS. Why? Because the reason for your high sodium level here would be the loss of water. So plain NSS also has water in it. Okay? And most of the solutes in it, the sodium chloride of 154 MEQ, will stay in your intravascular space, thus may help bring the blood pressure up and at the same time dilute the sodium in the extracellular fluid by adding more water to it. Okay, B5.3 you may use for hypernatremia, but it will not help you with your blood pressure or not as much as plain NSS. So you will need liters, several liters of B5.3 or and B5 water for your BP to go up. Okay, and then most of the time you end up flooding the lungs because of too much fluids already. 3% hypertonic, well, obviously, because your sodium is already high, 150. So for fluid resuscitation in adults, okay, so our target mainly is to maintain a urine output of 0.5 to 1 ml per kilogram body weight per hour. Okay, you also have to take note that fluid calculations are not absolute because, again, we have sensible and insensible water losses. So if you have excessive urine volumes, you may be overcorrecting and run the risk of fluid overload. Okay, because again, if your kidneys are intact, it will adapt. So whatever it doesn't need, it will just remove from the body. If you have lower urine volumes or smaller volumes, that may indicate inadequate resuscitation, so you need to add more. Therefore, you have to monitor your urine output strictly every hour, especially if you're doing fluid resuscitation. So in pediatrics, this is what they use, the Holiday-Selgar rule. But as you can see, it's only up to more than 20 kilograms. But basically, you can use this also, but it tends to be more excessive and tedious if you compute for it. So what we use is actually this one, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or the NICE guidelines, fluid therapy in adults. So basically, what you need to do is to assess whether the patient is hypovolemic. So what are the indicators? You may have low blood pressure, tachycardia, capillary refill time is more than 2 seconds, your peripheries are cold to touch, respiratory rate may be more than 20 breaths per minute, and if you do passive leg raising, which is like the opposite of postural dizziness or orthostatic hypotension, no? If you do passive leg raising and your BP goes up, then your patient is fluid responsive and may benefit from giving more IVF, more fluids. Laboratory investigations should also include the full blood count. What are we looking for in your CBC? Basically, it's the hematocrit. Okay, and you have your urea, of course, creatinine, and your electrolytes. So the first thing that you do, choose an appropriate IVF. So crystalloids are the best IVF fluids to do resuscitation. They contain around 130 to 154 millimoles per liter of sodium chloride, which is approximately what we have in the plasma. So for patients who have low blood pressures, the first thing that you have to do, of course, check blood pressure. If it's low and you still have clear breath sounds, you may give a bolus of 500 ml over less than 15 minutes. So fast drip 500 ml. And then you repeat this until you have achieved some sort of stability. Like your systolic blood pressure went up to a safe level, or your heart rate decreased to at least less than 90, or on the other hand, if you have already developed trials, meaning the body cannot accommodate that much fluids. So for routine maintenance fluids, the IV fluids for routine maintenance, we use around 25 to 30 ml per kilogram per day. So that's per day. So for obese patients, just remember you compute the ideal body weight and not the actual weight. Okay? And consider less fluid for patients who are elderly or frail because they easily congest, those who have renal impairment or cardiac failure, and malnourished patients. Okay? So these are the types of people or the population that easily congests. That's why you have to really assess carefully and weigh how much fluid you're going to give as routine maintenance. So for the placement and redistribution, you have to adjust the IV prescription, okay? And you have to account for your existing fluid and or electrolyte deficits or excesses or ongoing losses or abnormal distribution, okay? So remember those scenarios wherein you'd have more water loss, fever, burns, tachypnea, presence of drains. So take that into consideration also and adjust your IV prescription accordingly. Problem number 3. So you have a 70-year-old male diagnosed case of congestive heart failure and comes to the ER complaining of chest pain. PE showed cold clammy extremities. You now have bilateral bibasal rals and you also have edema, grade 2. So you suspect that he might have acute coronary syndrome. So vital signs of the ER were blood pressure of a blood pressure of 80/40. Your heart rate is 74. Your RR is 20, and your initial lab showed a normal sodium of 135, normal potassium of 3.6, and normal chloride of 98. So in this scenario, what's your IVF of choice and at what rate will you start it? So always go back to the problem. So first problem is our blood pressure. It's inadequate, 80/40. So the question now here is, will we hydrate or not? Definitely, you need to hydrate in other settings. But then, can you hydrate a person who already has bibasal rals and bipedal edema, which are signs of fluid overload? You cannot. So basically, you need to lower down your rate. So definitely letter A, letter C, and letter D are out. No? 120 cc per hour will flood your lungs and will aggravate your congestion. So your choices now would be A or B. Between the two, D5 water and plain NSS, you can actually use either, but preferably we would want to use plain NSS because of the fact that it's the one that's going to stay in the extracellular fluid compartment. If you give D5 water, you also hydrate the intercellular fluid compartment. So if you cannot hydrate, like in this case, and your blood pressure is still low, what is the proper course of action? So this is where your inotropic support comes in. So you have norepinephrine, dobutamine, dopamine. Okay, so these are the things that you need to take into consideration. Okay, so always assess your patients. So now we go to electrolytes. Electrolytes, these are chemical compounds in a solution that have the ability to conduct an electrical current. So they are distributed in different concentrations because obviously we have transporters, we have pumps, and they usually break into ions. Like sodium is positive and chloride is negative. So they break into two, sodium chloride, but they always go together. So cations have positive charges and ions have negative charges. So they are needed to keep body's balance of fluids and maintain normal function. Okay, so some electrolytes, their effect would be in the heart rhythm, muscle contraction, or brain function. So this is just a recap. You should know this by now, because of the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. Look at your extracellular fluid compartment. Bulk of it is comprised of sodium. The intercellular fluid compartment, most of it is potassium. Some would be phosphorus, magnesium, protein. This is another graphic representation, easier to remember. So basically, what's inside the cell is potassium, phosphorus. Outside the cell is sodium, calcium, chloride. So these are the normal values and of your electrolytes. So no need to memorize this for now, but remember, because you will be eating this every day when you go into the clinics, eventually you will be able to memorize them. So let's go to sodium. So sodium, the normal concentration is 135 to 145. This is the most prevalent cation in the extracellular fluid. Already know that. Controls osmotic pressure of the extracellular fluid. And water goes where sodium goes. Okay? Kidneys provide actually the major route by which you can regulate sodium. So this is where excess sodium ions are excreted if it's too much, and sodium ions are reabsorbed when it's too little. So the hormones that actually regulate sodium reabsorption would be aldosterone, your atrial natriuretic peptide, which both increases, wherein aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption, and your atrial natriuretic peptide, which increases sodium excretion. So note that chloride usually accompanies sodium. Why is this? Because the tubular locations that reabsorb chloride are almost the same as those for sodium. So they always go hand in hand. They always are in a pair. So as a recap, this is your hormones that regulate sodium. So I won't go into that deeper. I want you to remember these and their effects. Okay, especially actually all aldosterone, renin, angiotensin, antidiuretic hormone. So hypernatremia. So hypernatremia, by the word itself, you have a plasma sodium of more than 145. So the normal is 135 to 145. So in this case, your plasma osmolality, because you have too much sodium in the extracellular fluid, you will expect higher plasma osmolalities, like 295. You will also suspect increase in the specific gravity because your kidneys will try to compensate for it by excreting more sodium, and an increased urine osmolality, again by your kidneys compensating for it by excreting more sodium to bring equilibrium back into the body. So this is another picture of how it is to your what it does to your cells when you have isotonic solutions, hypotonic solutions, or hypertonic solutions. So there. When you're talking about sodium, the main organ that is basically involved is the brain. Causes cellular dehydration, therefore neurologic symptoms. So if you encounter patients who present with neurologic symptoms like lethargy, weakness, slow to answer, always get sodium, because this might be because of low sodium levels in the body. So we have a case here. A 78-year-old female was admitted due to palpitations. She was managed for atrial fibrillation and amiodarone was already started. However, on the second hospital day, she was noted to have onset of sudden decrease in sensorium. Okay, so basically what happened was that she had a stroke. She was intubated and placed on mechanical ventilation. So upon repeating the labs the following day, you now have a sodium of 165, which is way above normal. Potassium slightly low, 3.4. The BP range was around 90 to 100, borderline. A little on tachycardic, and the temperature is 38 degrees Celsius. The net fluid balance, which is the difference between your input and output in 24 hours, is positive 500 mm. So what is the cause of this patient's hypernatremia? So this is where actually it's sodium and potassium that has algorithms, complicated algorithms. But to summarize, these are the possible etiologies for hypernatremia. So you either have water loss or sodium gain, either of the two. And then the common causes of renal water loss would be your diuresis, osmotic diuresis. You may also see that this in hyperglycemia, wherein you spill so much sugar in the urine and water also follows it. You have excess urea, post-obstructive diuresis, and your mannitol. Water diuresis may also occur in central diabetes insipidus, wherein you have decreased antidiuretic hormone secretion. So you have the inability to reabsorb water. So you usually have liters and liters of urine output. So much water is lost in the urine when you have diabetes insipidus. Nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, it's a resistance. So you don't have an abnormality in the amount of your antidiuretic hormone, but this time your kidneys are not responsive to it. Okay, so this might be genetic. Other possible causes of water diuresis would be hypercalcemia, your hypokalemia, and your drugs like your lithium and ifosfamide. Okay, so this is the algorithm that I was talking about. So basically, you can deduce whether or not it's from a water loss or a sodium gain. So these are the signs and symptoms. Again, most of the time, it's the signs and symptoms of dehydration as well. Polyuria, anorexia, nausea, vomiting, thirst, dry and swollen tongue, fever, dry and flushed skin. And the neurologic findings would be the mild ones would be lethargy, weakness, or irritability, but the extreme ones would include twitching, seizures, coma, and even death. So the appropriate response of the body in hypernatremia would be to increase your AVP, your antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so you will have to reabsorb more water so that you will have more water retained in the body. This will bring back the normal concentration of sodium in the blood. So when this is activated, you'd have excretion of lower volumes of maximally concentrated urine. So this is the reason why if you don't drink like enough water in a day, if you're reviewing for an exam, for example, and you're trying to study so hard, you forgot to drink water. You'd expect that when you urinate, it would be very, very yellow and the volume would be smaller. Okay? So plasma sodium concentration of more than 150 is virtually never seen in an alert adult with a normal thirst mechanism with access to water because of that mechanism. No? Our first fail-safe programming for dehydration, the thirst mechanism. So if your patient is awake, can verbalize if he or she is thirsty or not, then most of the time you won't get this high sodium. What's the problem with our patient? Our patient actually had a stroke and was intubated and placed on mechanical ventilator. So therefore, she cannot ask for more water even if she would want to. The thirst mechanism is not working. Okay, so if your plasma osmolarity even goes a little higher than 285, it will already secrete ADH and trigger your thirst mechanism. Okay. So the CNS reaction to hypernatremia, the reason why the symptoms of your hypernatremia would be neurologic is because of the shift of water from the intracellular brain cells to the extracellular spaces. So the brain tends to shrink. And then when they shrink, capillaries dilate and they possibly rupture. So they may cause cerebral hemorrhage, blood clots, and neurologic dysfunction. So just for now, keep this in mind, you may copy it, bring it with you in the clinics because you will use it if you have a case of hypernatremia. So again, we are lacking water. So we compute for water deficit. Okay, so this is the formula. But as for the management, it's pretty simple. If it's pure sodium and water loss, you may give plain NSS or plain LR, such as in cases of diarrhea. Okay? Pure water loss, like you're insipidus, you may give D5 water, free water. If you have a iatrogenic addition of sodium, nakasobra yung sodium, you may give isotonic or D5 water also. So the management is pretty simple. It's just that diagnosing would be hard. Hyponatremia. So case number 2, you have a 65-year-old female who was brought to the ER because of lethargy and weakness. She is a non-hypertensive, maintained on losartan plus a diuretic, thiazide diuretic, a hydrochlorothiazide, 50 per 12.5 milligrams, 1 tab once a day. So the vital signs, blood pressure, borderline, 90/60, heart rate, borderline as well, 100. But the initial labs revealed low sodium of 120, potassium of 4, a low plasma osmolarity, and the urine sodium of 40. What is the cause of our hyponatremia? So this is where the algorithms come in. So basically, when you have hyponatremia, you have an imbalance between your water and your sodium. You have more water than sodium particles in that compartment. Okay, so the first thing that you have to do is assess plasma osmolality. Check if it's low, normal, or high. If it's low, that would mean you'd have or you might have more water than solutes. So assess volume status next. Is the patient hypovolemic, euvolemic, or hypervolemic? If hypervolemic, meaning your patient is retaining water, such as in cases of congestive heart failure, renal failure, or cirrhosis, then the management here would be to diurese the patient. Okay? So it's different if your patient is hypovolemic and euvolemic. So if your patient is hypovolemic, low blood pressure levels, what do you usually ask for after that? Your urinary sodium and osmolality for you to be able to determine what's causing the hyponatremia. Okay, in our case, the urine sodium was 40, which is more than 25. So most likely the cause of that patient's hyponatremia would be the thiazide part of her maintenance medications. Okay, if it's euvolemic, then you have a variety of choices. That's usually due to SIADH or your syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion. So to diagnose hyponatremia, you have to have a plasma concentration of less than 135. Of course, the reverse or the opposite of your hypernatremia, you have decreased serum osmolality and a decreased urine sodium and urine osmolality because your kidneys will try to expel more water in order to bring equilibrium back in the body. So if you have low plasma osmolality, you most often cause water movement into the cells, causing the cells to swell. Okay? So you will cause cellular overhydration. So this usually results from either solute loss or water retention. Mostly it's water retention. Okay? And then the symptoms would still be neurologic. Okay? Wherein water will tend to move into the brain cells as opposed to your hypernatremia, which dehydrates it. So basically, you will have swollen brain cells. Okay, so it depends on the level of your sodium. You correlate that with the severity of the symptoms. So the lower the sodium content, the more severe the symptoms are. So if you reach already 110, 115, you may have seizures and coma. For the etiology, you might have from the algorithm earlier, diuretics, excessive sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, SIADH, aldosterone deficiency, and cardiac renal liver disease. Okay, so for the management, there's only two. It's either you give more sodium or you restrict water so you won't have water retention. So these are the conditions wherein you can give sodium chloride supplementation if you're giving diuretics, if you have adrenal insufficiency or through water depletion. And then you restrict water if you have signs of fluid overload, and SIADH. Okay. So if in hypernatremia, we compute for water deficit. In hyponatremia, we compute for sodium deficit. So you just keep this in mind and try to use it in the clinics when the time comes. So for the treatment, there's actually a guideline, a rule. You should not exceed 0.5 to 1 MEQ per liter per hour or 12 MEQ per liter per day. And you have to correct for ongoing losses. Why? Because you will put the patient at risk for osmotic demyelination syndrome or your ODS if you rapidly shift or rapidly change the levels of the sodium above the acceptable level, which is 12 per day. Okay? So remember that. Osmotic demyelination syndrome. So basically, if you have hypernatremia, for example, so you lose water from your brain cells, so your brain cells shrink, right? And then there is a compensatory mechanism in the brain that occurs wherein you'd have electrolytes enter the brain, and also the formation of your osmolytes, just to equate or maintain balance between the two compartments, so your patients won't get your brain cells destroyed. But then if you rapidly correct it, okay, if you rapidly corrected, the shifting of those electrolytes or sodium is relatively slower than your correction. What will happen? You will have the reverse. So you will also have, on the other hand, brain swelling. Okay, so when you have brain swelling in your CT scan or MRI, and you're suspect and you had a change of sodium of more than 12 MEq per day, then your patient might have had or might have ODS, or osmotic demyelination syndrome. So let's go to potassium. So potassium, the normal level is 3.5 to 5, and the most abundant cation in the ICF, and only 2% is extracellular. So take note. So what we basically get when we get serum electrolytes is just 2% the total. Okay? So most of the potassium is maintained intracellularly. So its main functions are nerve conduction and muscle contraction, and it helps maintain acid-base balance. Okay? So this is entirely dependent on kidney function, because it's the kidneys that mainly regulate potassium. You also have to note that magnesium usually accompanies potassium, just like chloride accompanying sodium. So if you have hypokalemia, for example, and you have not corrected magnesium, or if you also have magnesium depletion, there would be inhibitory effects on your muscle sodium potassium ATPase activity. You'd have exaggerated potassium secretion by the distal nephron, reduction of magnesium, which is causes intercellular block of your potassium efflux through the ROMK in principal cells, ultimately causing to perpetuate the hypokalemia. So you cannot correct potassium or your potassium if you do not correct the magnesium. Okay? So hypokalemia is refractory to correction without magnesium replacement. So you might be wondering, you've already given too much potassium, but your potassium isn't correcting. You check the magnesium levels, it might be low. So for the regulation of potassium, it's mainly by aldosterone. Aldosterone reabsorbs sodium but throws away potassium. So if you have excess of this aldosterone, what will happen? You'd have lower levels of potassium in the body. Okay? There are also instances wherein you'd have cellular shifting of your potassium, since it is mainly intracellular. So you have conditions wherein potassium goes inside of the cell, and some conditions wherein your potassium will be pushed to the extracellular fluid compartment, such as those seen in acidosis, okay, your beta-2 adrenoceptor antagonists. So these conditions are actually the cause of the hyperkalemia in these cases would be the redistribution of potassium from the intracellular to the extracellular fluid compartment. So watch out for those also. So in order for you to diagnose hypokalemia, you should have a potassium of less than 3.5. So the usual causes would be alkalosis, causing transcellular shift into the cell, insulin administration, reduced potassium intake, increased renal losses, prolonged vomiting, diarrhea, or fistulas. So for the diagnosis, of course, you have a low potassium. And if sodium, the signs and symptoms are usually neurologic. In potassium, take note of the electrical conduction or the ECG reading. So you may have clues there that will tell you that you have actually hypokalemia. Okay, so you'd have flattened depressed T waves or the presence of U waves, and your ABG would most likely show you metabolic alkalosis, causing further shifting of potassium intracellularly. So this is by virtue of the hydrogen-potassium exchange and your bicarbonate potassium co-transporter. So that's what's causing that shift in the potassium based on the blood pH, if it's alkalosis or acidosis. So for the clinical features, you have cardiac, skeletal, intestinal muscle cells involvement. Early signs would be malaise, weakness or cramps, frequent cramping. You always check for electrolytes, ileus, such as bloatedness, hyporeflexia, paralysis, and actually the worst would be sudden cardiac deaths from cardiac arrhythmias or dysrhythmias caused by hypokalemia. Okay, so we have a case here. A 25-year-old male was brought to the ER due to bilateral lower extremity weakness. Vital signs at the ER. You have a very high blood pressure for a 25-year-old male, 180/70. Your heart rate is 80. And the initial labs showed a sodium of 135, potassium of 1.7, but the rest were normal. So what do you think is the cause of this hypokalemia? So the first thing that you have to do here would be to check if this is pseudohypokalemia. Are there abnormal WBCs which take in a lot of the extracellular fluid potassium and keeps it inside the cell? So if you have an abundance of cells, then you'd have pseudohypokalemia. Pseudo meaning you don't really have a deficit in the potassium, but it's just hidden inside the cell. Okay. Apparent hypokalemia would also be because of an artifact of a storage procedure like your citrate. So the first thing that you have to, again, get or rule out is pseudohypokalemia. Then you measure the urine potassium. Is this potassium wasting, or you really have inadequate potassium levels in the body? Okay, so if you have lots of potassium in the urine, check the blood pressure. If the blood pressure is high, then most often your renin and your aldosterone hormones are involved in it. So you might have RAS, Conn syndrome, Cushing's, apparent mineral corticoid excess, Liddle syndrome. Actually, in this case, the answer would be your mineral corticoid excess, your hyperaldosteronism. Okay. But if your blood pressure is neither high, it's either low or normal, then check the plasma bicarbonate level. So you might be dealing with renal tubular acidosis or either losses, you have ongoing losses of potassium. So for the management, KCL actually, for your information, is very painful. So there's a limit to what or how much potassium you can give via the peripheral line and via the central line. Okay. Peripheral lines, they're smaller and then they tend to burst more. If your potassium extravasates because your line is out, what will happen? You will have necrosis of the tissue surrounding that area. Okay. So according to Harrison's, the recommendation would be 20 mg per liter of plain NSS. The usual daily requirement is 40 mg per day, and the relative contraindications to potassium therapy, relative, is untreated renal failure. Basically, you don't have the capacity to remove excess potassium anymore, or temporary renal shutdown. You don't have urine output. So you don't have a vehicle for you to remove all those extra potassium. Hyperkalemia, your serum potassium is more than 5. So this is usually the result from the shifting of potassium from the intracellular space to the extracellular compartment. So this may be seen in cell traumas, metabolic acidosis, as explained earlier, and a decreased renal excretion of potassium, such as in cases of hypoaldosteronism and renal failure. So this one is a little bit more easier. If you have hyperkalemia, first thing that you have to do is rule out spurious or redistribution, your pseudo hyperkalemias. And then the next, check for renal function. So if your GFR is less than 20, then most definitely the cause of your hyper-K would be renal failure. If it's normal, your creatinine is normal, then you may have either aldosterone deficiency or tubular hyperkalemia. So the diagnosis is made also or can be seen also in the ECG with peak T waves and wide QRS complexes. And the ABG would almost always show metabolic acidosis. So the signs and symptoms here would still be arrhythmia, the worst one. You may have tachy or bradycardia or ventricular dysrhythmias. They may even have SVTs, supraventricular tachycardia or ventricular tachycardias. Skeletal muscle weakness or paralysis may also be seen, and if unmanaged, a very high potassium level in the body would also lead to cardiac arrest. So again, with the potassium hydrogen exchange that occurs in acidosis, so this is the main mechanism why there is transcellular shifting when there is metabolic acidosis. So potassium actually goes out of the cell because the hydrogen ions would be exchanged and will be put inside or intracellularly so that you would have a lower, a better blood pH. So as for the treatment, these are the treatments. You have calcium gluconate, which decreases membrane instability. Your GI solution, we call it GI solution, but basically it's regular insulin plus D50 water, 50 ml. So this one causes transcellular shifting, correction of acidosis, or making it alkaline, more alkaline, or from acidosis to alkalosis, there would also be transcellular shifting. But the most effective ways to get rid of the extra potassium would be to give furosemide, and cation exchange resins, your kayexalate or your calimate, and in extreme cases, dialysis. Okay, this is the only way you can totally remove, or totally lower down body potassium, and not just keep it inside the cell. Calcium. Normal calcium is 4 to 5.5, but it depends on the unit of measurement. So it forms bones, teeth. And what you have to understand here is that calcium has an inverse relationship with phosphorus. So the formation of its functions are actually formation and mineralization of bones or teeth, muscular contraction and relaxation, and cardiac function. That's why cardiologists are very particular with the levels of calcium and magnesium, especially in their MI patients or cardiac patients. So I hope you remember this. I won't go into detail about the action potentials, how muscle contracts. I just want you to remember that calcium is a very big part of it. So these are the hormones involved in the regulation of calcium. You have parathyroid hormones, calcitonin, and calcitriol. And what I would want to emphasize also is that there are two kinds of calcium. You have total calcium and ionized calcium. If you're getting total calcium, then you have to factor in albumin. You get the adjusted or the corrected calcium, which is approximately which approximates how much calcium is in the body. But if you're already getting ionized calcium, no need to get albumin and compute the corrected calcium because ionized calcium is equivalent to the actual. Okay? So for the diagnosis, it's pretty straightforward, but you may also see ECG changes. So the etiology would be calcium supplements, overuse of it, malignancies, hyperparathyroidism, prolonged immobilization, and even your thiazide diuretics. So for the signs and symptoms, it's a little non-specific from now on. So you might have nausea, vomiting, anorexia, and because why clinically dry? Because calcium is also an extracellular cation. Okay, so if you have hypercalcemia, that would mean the ratio of water and calcium in your extracellular fluid also has a problem. This may occur this may also show in extreme cases, hypercalcemic crisis, the renal manifestations of which would be polyuria, acute tubular necrosis, nephrolithiasis. And cardiovascular system might be affected also because of all those ECG changes. You may have ventricular tachyarrhythmias and CNS lethargy, seizures, and coma. So at this point, the symptoms, the signs and symptoms overlap. They overlap already. So for the treatment, first thing that you have to do is expand extracellular fluid volume because again, it's an ECF cation along with sodium. So you have to hydrate around 3 to 6 liters per day. And then you may give furosemide to aid in the excretion of calcium through the urine, through the kidneys. But for longer control of your calcium, you may give bisphosphonates like your pamidronate. Your calcitonin is actually short-term only, miacalcit nasal spray. Glucocorticoids may also cause decreases in calcium levels, and in extreme cases, really, you can do parathyroidectomy. So the etiology of, okay, let's go to hypocalcemia on the other hand. So hypocalcemia, again, we don't have an algorithm for this anymore. The etiologies are pretty straightforward. The most common cause of hypocalcemia would be after surgery, okay? Especially for thyroidectomy or after parathyroidectomy, okay? So that's when you develop hypokalemia. So to diagnose if your hypercalcemia have shortened QT interval, this time it's prolonged QT interval. So remember your signs and symptoms, your Vos-Tex, Chassos, okay? Vos-Tex sign, you tap the facial nerve and then you have twitching. And then a positive to sign would be cramping of the hand when you inflate the cuff tight enough, okay, for you to have impairment in the circulation. For the treatment of hypocalcemia, you have calcium gluconate. So basically replace it. Replace it with calcium gluconate. So you if it's very, very low and you're already symptomatic, you may give a very slow IV push of calcium gluconate, 20 ml. And then the rest, you may dilute it and give it in 24 hours. You may also add vitamin D3 to aid in the reabsorption of calcium if necessary. Okay, so to magnesium, the normal would be 1.3 to 2.1, and second to potassium in the intercellular fluid compartment. So the function is now pretty much deeper. Okay, there's utilization of ATP, protein and DNA synthesis, neuromuscular irritability, and they also produce vasodilation for peripheral arteries. So just to emphasize, we get magnesium actually from our diet, and it is absorbed in the gut, and it's redistributed in the magnesium pools such as the bone, the muscle. You have some in your RBCs, okay, and in your basically in your extracellular fluid compartment. So for the etiology, it's also straightforward. You may have inadequate intake of it, or you lose too much of it through diarrhea or malabsorption, or you might have congenital anomalies like your Barter's Kittelman's, wherein you really waste away magnesium. Okay, you have magnesium loss, wasting in the urine. Other causes would include alcohol withdrawal, thyrotoxicosis, burns, GI suctioning, aminoglycosides, and insulin therapy. So to diagnose hypomagnesemia, you also have ECG changes. So cardiologists are actually very particular with magnesium levels, calcium levels, potassium levels, because all of these might cause arrhythmias. Okay? So actually, your magnesemia or magnesium hypomagnesemia may cause or coexist with both hypo-K and hypocalcemia. That's why the signs and symptoms, they overlap. You have signs and symptoms of hypo-K and you have signs and symptoms of hypocalcemia as well. So for the treatment, you just have to replace. Okay, so there are a lot of different magnesium preparations in the market. You have magnesium sulfate, you have magnesium oxide. No, before they use aluminum magnesium, which is Maalox, but they avoid this now because of very poor oral absorption, and it causes more diarrhea. If it's mild, you can just give tablets, and if it's severe, you may give it as drips. For hypermagnesemia, it's very easy. You have only a couple of things to consider. Renal failure is one, because as just like potassium, it's the kidneys that regulate magnesium levels in the body. Iatrogenic hypermagnesemia as the result of the treatment of preeclampsia or adrenal insufficiency. Again, they may cause or coexist with hypocalcemia, causing also evidences of hypocalcemia, signs and symptoms of hypocalcemia. So you also have weakness, paralysis, respiratory failure. Then on ECG, you have prolonged PR intervals, QTC intervals. You may also have heart blocks. Again, because that is why cardiologists are very particular with these three electrolytes: your potassium, calcium, magnesium. Okay. So the treatment would be to withdraw therapy of magnesium preparations. But if it's already very severe and symptomatic, you first give calcium gluconate to stabilize the membrane. You may give loop diuretics, but if the patient is not responding to loop diuretics, then do dialysis. Last, phosphates. Phosphates are the major anion in the intracellular compartment. So I've shown this already earlier. The normal range would again be based on the unit of measurement, 2.5 to 4.5 milligrams per liter. So, and it almost always has a reciprocal relationship with calcium. So just like magnesium, it goes a little deeper. It's a component of bones, but it's also needed to generate ATP, and they are components of DNA and RNA. So the hormones involved in the regulation of phosphorus would almost be similar with the regulation of calcium, your parathyroid hormone, and your calcitonin. Okay? So for hyperphosphatemia, you'd have, of course, high phosphorus levels, the etiology of which would be excess vitamin D, renal failure, tissue trauma, because again, phosphorus is intracellular. So if you have too much hemolysis, you might have too much phosphorus in the extracellular fluid compartment. Hypoparathyroidism as an effect, or as an effect of hypoparathyroidism, you might have hyperphosphatemia. So again, with the signs and symptoms, basically overlaps with calcium. So you may have tetany, tachycardia, palpitations, muscle weakness, soft tissue calcifications. Hypophosphatemia, on the other hand, if you have low phosphorus levels, the etiologies would be, the common ones would be chronic alcoholism. You may see this in patients on prolonged hyperventilation, especially COPD patients. Poor dietary intake, respiratory alkalosis may also cause hypophosphatemia. So again, the signs and symptoms, they are non-specific, not like sodium and potassium, for example, and calcium. So you might have irritability, fatigue, weakness, paresthesias, confusion, seizures, and even coma. Okay. So I guess that ends my lecture. I hope I made it simple enough for you to understand at least the basics. Fluids and electrolytes is a very, 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 very long topic, and it's a whole book if you really want to go in depth. But at least you won't be so clueless anymore when you go into the clinics. Okay? So thank you everyone for listening. And if you do have questions, you may message me or email me anytime. No? So my email is trishmanalaysay, small caps, trishmanalaysay@gmail.com. Okay? Thank you and have a good day.